as authoritative?
You all heard the question. And I think, please give me your name.
Brad Hubbard.
Brad, I think the seriousness of that question for many, many years has been felt more in certain parts of the world, and now it is felt very seriously here too. Once upon a time, one could easily say that the Bible says so-and-so, and the listener would be very eager to listen to it, but now one has to defend the very authority that which you are, from which you are presenting your case. It is very important any time you are presenting the gospel message to an honest skeptic, and that's an important statement. Sometimes you will run across a dishonest skeptic, or one who's trying to really raise question after question after question, and is not really hoping you'll have an answer, but hoping you'll stumble so that everything can be set in reverse. But if you've got an honest skeptic, the way you start answering those questions is by asking questions of the questioner. And Jesus did this repeatedly. If you notice the number of people to whom he talked who came to him with a question, he questioned the questioner, because the questioner does two things. It helps the questioner to open up within his or her own assumptions. And number two, then it determines the entry point of the discussion. To start, for example, with a naturalist with the place of the miracles, it would be pointless, because the naturalist will just dismiss the possibility or the relevance of the miraculous. But on the other hand, if the naturalist does admit that there are moral struggles that we all live with, that we need to find an absolute in some way, then you move towards that argument that without the possibility of framing a transcendent objective basis for morality, you cannot really answer the questions of right or wrong, good and bad. Pragmatism is the only hope that we have. So actually what you're doing is building a worldview from the existential tug point of the questioner. And that's where you start. You start where the existential rub is legitimately felt. To cerebrally go with the documents of the Old and the New Testament, for example, as important as it might be for a theological student or a seminarian, to many a questioner, that is totally unimportant, or at least they just dismissed it as not able to stand up to the scrutiny of study of document authenticity and so on. So you have to go from a worldview and the particulars of the worldview at which the points are broken. I'll tell you why I find this so important. If you go to parts of the Middle East today, for example, where you will find somebody from an Islamic background who's becoming a Christian, 99% of the times, you can check this out, you will find the person who says, I have now committed my life to Christ from that former belief system, will say to you it either happened because of a dream he or she had, or a vision he or she had, or the loving example of another Christian that won them over. After they come to know Christ is when the apologetic struggle begins, because the need has been met existentially, and now the questions are being phrased. They don't know how to deal with the questions that are being tossed. So if God himself comes to individuals on the basis of their deepest felt needs and struggles, I think that's where we need to begin too. The woman at the well had all kinds of questions about worship in this mountain or that mountain. And he pointed out to her what her real problem was, that her life was fragmented, it was broken, her life was shattered, and he knew everything about her, and yet offered her the drink that would make her never thirst again. So I think you have to deal with it at the felt point of the individual struggle. The other intellectual issues are very real, but they are not to be brought in at an introductory stage, because it just leaves it in the cognitive realm without dealing with where the struggle really is. Now, if the person says to you outright, I cannot accept the Bible as authority for the following reasons, then you begin there. But if you are introducing the scriptures and the person says, yeah, I don't accept that, and you see in the conversation, say, why not? Well, I really don't believe a God of love who's all-powerful can allow so much of evil and suffering in this world. Well, then that's where you begin the response, I think, you say. Yes, sir.
How do you confront your own personal doubt?
I'm sorry, sir, please.
How do you confront your personal doubt?
You know, I've never been asked that question, but but I have talked about it. I've talked about it to my kids. I've talked about it to my colleagues. To my wife and I have talked a lot about it. I have never, ever had a moment's doubt from the moment of my conversion as to who Jesus Christ is. Never. In fact, I've only become deeper and deeper in my love and my knowledge of Him. The biggest stumbling block for me, and I have to be very honest with you, and it may be a fearsome thing to even say in public, the biggest thing that troubles me in the Christian faith is why I see so many people who claim to love Him, whose lives are so far from what He wants us to be. And I don't just mean we are not as godly as we need to be, but why is there so much contradiction and hypocrisy in the lives? Sometimes the deeper, sometimes the more scriptures quoting the person, the less Christ-like you see the person. And I have struggled with that. You know, I think it is so important that we claim that this is a supernatural work, that that supernatural effect be there. But you know, C.S. Lewis made a point. He said the only thing you'd have to say to yourself is just think of how much worse they would have been if they didn't know Him. You know, there's a point of comfort in that, and in that we need to be patient and tolerant with each other. In terms of the authority of the Scriptures, the persuasion of God's existence and the person of Jesus Christ as being the only way to God, never doubted that for a moment. I've only become deeper and deeper in my faith. The manifestation of supernatural work and its paucity sometimes troubles me. And I have to go humbly before the Lord myself and say, forgive me for failing you there. But I hope that in those failings we draw closer to Him at the end and not get content in that divided line there.
How does one overcome the privatization that Christians have been forced on in this society?
Please repeat the latter part. How does one?
How does one overcome the privatization that's been forced on Christians?
The privatization?
Yeah.
You know, I was born in a part of the world where nobody ever apologized for their religious beliefs to me, and I respected them for it. I've never had a Hindu, a Muslim, or Buddhist, or Sikh ever apologize to me or keep their religion to the private. So I was raised in a culture where I was a minority when I came to know Christ. And now I come to a culture where if I were a Hindu, I'd be given greater freedoms in this culture to practice my belief than if I were, than as I am a Christian. Boggles my mind. I was on a talk show and somebody asked me if I feared the destruction that terrorism could bring to the country. I said, nowhere near as I fear the intellectuals are trying to destroy the faith in God in this country. I said, at least the terrorist comes with an open weapon and you know what he's trying to do. The intellectual who comes and undermines the very ground on which you stand can become a very dangerous entity to a nation in terms of mocking one's faith and ridiculing that which is sacred. This is something we need to learn in North America, that when there's a desacralization that takes place, its logical outworking is dreadful. So my answer is very simple in my own life, and I can answer it the way I deal with it. First, I have never, not because of a because of a Schwarzenegger build, as is obvious, I have never shied away from any situation that I've been invited to speak in. The more hostile, the more I'm likely to take it. I think that's where the gospel needs to be taken. I have never, in about 4 weeks from now, I'm going to a very, very dangerous setting. And the people are even asking me if you're going to bring security guards with you. Nobody is going to take my life 1 minute sooner than God has intended for my life to end. So I don't fear that sort of thing. They will never intimidate me, and If the fear wants to be thrust, good luck. My life is committed to the Lord, and He will guard me and guide me and take care of me. And that is true of all of us. So I don't think we should be fearful. Number two, where we are trying to change society by legislation is a completely different type of a challenge. There are two ways to do that. The first way to do it is to live the Christian life in such a way so that the person's life is changed, so that the laws are not just changed for the sake of changing laws, but the person's convictions are changed, and hence the laws are changed as a result, where society has the salt. If we Christians are salt, our lives will make a difference in the end, even in the structure in which the country functions. But secondly, and more importantly, it is important to voice what we believe very clearly, but never to do it without the undergirding of love. If you undergird deep conviction with love, you will find the winsomeness of the argument more persuasive. If it is not undergirded by love, then the position you hold becomes repulsive to the individual, and the system itself, it becomes obnoxious. So I would say that salt changes within the system. Proclamation changes undergirded by love. When Jesus ascended into heaven, the church was heavily outnumbered. Heavily, something like 1 to 30,000. And it was the Greek philosophers around, there was Judaism around, there was so many other worldviews around. And yet they conquered in idea the known world of their time. That's what the Holy Spirit is about. That Corinth ever had a church in it is one of the miracles in early church history. And that Athens, I hate to get sidetracked, but I was in Athens 3 or 4 times before I noticed this. Right under the Areopagus and the Parthenon, magnificent setting, one of the most beautiful streets in Athens, if any one of you has ever been there, and Mars Hill right there. And Paul's whole sermon on Mars Hill is there, carved, both etched in metal and carved on stone there. But I noticed for the first time, as I was walking on the street that looks at Mars Hill and the Areopagus, the street is called Dionysius Areopagitos, Dionysius the Areopagite. He was the one who made his commitment to Christ on Mars Hill when Paul finished preaching. 2,000 years have gone by. A street is named after a fellow who attended Paul's meeting and became the first bishop of Athens after that. I was in Larnaca last year with my wife, and startled to find out the grave of Lazarus. He became a pastor in Cyprus, and his grave was excavated in 900. On his grave it just says, Lazarus, Bishop of Larnaca, 3 days dead, friend of Jesus. Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. So the gospel will conquer the resistant. Don't let society sever the nerve of your public belief and your private belief. They may limit us, they cannot eradicate it. And I just say, with boldness but with love, take your stand. And the fact that in a university such as this, we are still given the privilege of meeting, it's because somebody has the courage to go and ask, and somebody else had the courtesy to say, all right. And I think it'll happen. I'm far more optimistic about all of this, because I think in a generation like yours, big things lie ahead. But don't be afraid.
My question doesn't directly relate to your lecture today, but it's something I wanted to ask you after reading the chapter on sufferings in the book, Cries of the Heart. How can you present the gospel to a friend who's been raped at a young age how can you answer that question that everybody asks, why is there evil in the world when God so loves his people? How can you address that question when the pain is personal and it's not a mere concept? Yeah,
I appreciate that, Linda, and I think in Cries of the Heart, I made one attempt at it. In Jesus Among Other Gods, I made another attempt at it. Let me just, for the sake of the other listeners, at least position it a little bit philosophically and then move to the existential response here. Philosophically, there are two things we need to bear in mind. Whenever a person raises the problem of evil, they are implicitly also positing the existence of good. When you say something is evil, you assume something is good. When you assume something is good, you assume there's a moral law by which to differentiate between good and evil. And if you assume a moral law, you must ultimately posit a moral lawgiver. But that's whom the question is often trying to disprove and not prove. Because if there's no moral lawgiver, there's no moral law. If there's no moral law, there's no good. If there's no good, there's no evil. The question really self-destructs in terms of an objective rule by which to measure good and evil. It's very important to notice that the question in fact affirms that a moral framework exists in life. But the second thing is this: you move to the existential side of it. And I don't believe it's in Cries of the Heart, but I think it's in Jesus Among Other Gods. I've quoted a professor of philosophy from University of St. Louis in Missouri, Eleanor Stump, one of the finest Christian philosophers in our time. I encourage you to read her article in the book Philosophers Who Believe. And her entire essay deals with how she came to know Christ by facing the problem of suffering head on. And she gives the illustration of the Holocaust and the little village of Le Chambon in France, where so many lives were being captured by the Nazis and being tormented and all of that. And a little parsonage and young children and all began to rescue those who were being tormented there. And Eleanor Stump says a press reporter who was visiting Le Chambon had become hardened to all the evil that he had seen until he saw the binding of the wounds by these children and by the people of Le Chambon. It cracked open his heart and the tears came flowing, which had been bottled up for so long. Good has a way of cracking open a hardened heart from evil and suffering. It's another existential clue to the fact that evil alone hardens and coarsens, but when good enters, there's a sudden softening and a breaking down of that hard heart. When a woman has been raped, it has been the ultimate desecration and the plunder of a human being, because it has taken that which is the most private and sacred and invaded and violated. I cannot imagine the horrific emotional trauma. I think it defies human explanation. But it is so interesting that I have met and talked with some of those who have gone through that hell in their experience, who've admitted that while the wound still bleeds internally, they have seen the pain through different eyes after having come to know Christ. That wound does not stop, the wound bleeds inside, but the pain is a different kind of pain when they know that our Lord himself was plundered and violated. When you take a look at the cross, take a look at the very word excruciating. It comes from the Latin excruciatus. In other words, the cross transliterates two Latin words, which was the ultimate form of indignity and pain. The Lord of glory, naked before his creation, put outside the walls, mocked, bruised, beaten, and all of that. And in the pain and suffering that he took, he says, suffered in all points just as we are apart from sin. Because Christ comes in you, which is the only religious system in the world that talks about God himself coming in you, to live within you, that in this personal relationship, I suggest to you that the body which was desacralized in rape can somehow be lifted to the sanctity of becoming the temple of God once again. And that kind of conviction to move them from that indignity to the solace of Christ himself is a long process of loving and undergirding and knowing there will be periodic lapses when the memory haunts and hurts, but he is there to pick us up. There's a beautiful hymn written by Annie Johnston Flint, and with this I'll close, who was orphaned early in life. She was incontinent for many years in her life. She had rheumatoid arthritis and was lying crippled for many, many years. She, I think, got cancerous, and even blindness started to come in. And this marvelous woman wrote some of the greatest hymns ever, and one of those was, He giveth more grace when the burdens grow greater, He sendeth more strength when the labors increase. To added affliction He addeth His mercy, to multiplied trials His multiplied peace. When we have exhausted our store of endurance, when our strength has failed ere the day is half done, when we reach the end of our hoarded resources, our Father's full giving has only begun. His love has no limit, His grace has no measure, His power has no boundaries known unto men. For out of His infinite riches in Jesus He giveth and giveth and giveth again. God may use you to minister to that kind of person just in being Christ to the individual. And if there's any individual here who has suffered that agony, someone else can come alongside and be the arms of Christ to carry them. A very profound question, and only God is big enough to carry that person. God bless you. Thanks. Thank you.